Today will be a review of the Switch 2, but it's also going to be about the overall experience of owning a Nintendo Switch 2. As you can see here, I have the entire setup more or less ready to review. We're going to get into the different aspects of it that I liked, didn't like, have concerns about, and I think maybe Nintendo even undersold a couple of aspects of this unit right here. Of course, I did get to go to the Switch 2 experience in New York City, and I had overall positive impressions from the Switch 2, most of which really have panned out with my experiences thus far. As far as the overall experience of unboxing a Nintendo Switch 2, setup and everything, I don't know if there's much more that Nintendo could have done to make it an easier experience. However, there are a few things that immediately become problems with transferring over to the Switch 2. The first is that the Nintendo Switch 2 does come with 256 gigabytes of internal storage when you first launch it. However, if you're like me, you ended up purchasing a micro SD and loading it up with a ton of games for your original Nintendo Switch. Now, with the Switch 2, that micro SD is absolutely impossible to use, for reasons we'll get into in just a minute. But that means that all you have to fall back on is the 256 gigabytes you get in the unit itself. And when you go to transfer from your Switch, in my case my Switch OLED, to the Nintendo Switch 2, it tells you you should complete a transfer. Now, there are a lot of good things about this transfer, moving over a lot of your cloud data files, save files, and moving over your games. But the problem is, if you're like me and you have that extended storage and you have all those games, it will literally try to move every single game that you have. And if you want to cancel that, you have to do it literally one at a time. So I believe I had 512 gigabytes on my Switch OLED micro SD card. So obviously that's not going to fit into 256 gigabytes of Switch 2. So everything moved over, or at least attempted to. I had to cancel a whole bunch of downloads, and then on top of that, because I did want to install a few games that were Switch 2 specific, I had to uninstall a whole bunch of games that are initially downloaded. So don't have any preconceived notions about the internal storage of the Switch 2 being enough right off the bat. If you have any sort of library, it will not be enough space. Unless you're really only planning on playing a couple of games at a time. Maybe if you're playing older Switch 1 games or retro games, you can have more installed, but the overall number of games is going to be pretty limited if they're going to be modern titles. Now, in terms of setting up the Joy-Cons and going through the tutorials and everything, it's very self-explanatory. Nintendo is generally really good with this. They don't leave much to chance. They kind of try to foolproof their instructions, and it's very easy to get this thing up and running. That being said, there are still several aspects of the Switch 2 that are issues right off the bat. So I already mentioned the storage issue, but you also have to be updated to the current firmware, which defaults to the virtual game key cards. I think that for someone who's trading in their Switch or selling it after picking up a Switch 2, this is not going to be an issue. However, in my case, I pay for the family plan of the Switch membership, and I intend to loan games out to other family members, which of course is great for the virtual game cart. But in addition to that, you also have to load and unload games in between different Switches. So I mentioned my Switch OLED. If I want to run a game on the Switch OLED, I would then have to unload it from the Switch 2 and then load it on the Switch OLED, which makes it as cumbersome as a physical game, even on my digital games. Now, you can go back and change the settings to the original way that it was set up with the Nintendo Switch, which is basically that it has to be online and it has to check to see if your primary Switch has the game downloaded. But just be aware, it's going to default to this brand new virtual game card setup, which is a little bit of a nightmare if you plan on playing on multiple Switches. Another very strange thing about the Switch 2 is its HDR settings. So right off the bat, it's going to attempt to apply a fake HDR to pretty much everything that's in the system, like every game. You can change that to only compatible software. You can make some adjustments to it within the actual HDR settings themselves. However, again, they try to make it foolproof, but because of that, it's actually very difficult to get an accurate HDR setup on your Nintendo Switch 2 on your television. Now, in terms of the screen itself, this is not the best HDR screen that you could have. Obviously, an OLED would be a much better representation of HDR, but because the settings are not as exact as they should be, combined with the fact that the screen is not the strongest HDR screen for a handheld, you end up in a situation where your games, even straight out of the box, could look a little bit washed out and not really pop, despite the fact this is marketed as an HDR machine and an HDR screen. The other big thing that's going to be at the top of mind in the ownership experience of the Nintendo Switch 2 here is the overall cost. Now, the system itself, priced at $450, is not out of this world incredible. Nintendo jacking up the price just for the sake of, hosing their customers. And considering the overall power and performance of the hardware, it's honestly priced pretty much where it probably should be. The one thing that I think they did price terribly is their launch game, Mario Kart World. I don't think there's a single game on this system right now that is worth $80, especially considering that everything else to this point has been $70, including the biggest releases on basically any platform that are available. $70 has been the maximum to this point, and Mario Kart World, as much as you may like it, is not an $80 game. I'm sorry. However, just like I did, you can go with the pre-bundled Mario Kart World included with your Nintendo Switch 2, and despite the fact that you won't have a physical cartridge, you will save $30 on the purchase of a Nintendo game, which is pretty good considering how infrequently they reduce prices on their games. So I would highly recommend purchasing the bundle including Mario Kart World to save $30 off of a launch Nintendo game. And honestly, Mario Kart World should have been closer to $50. Probably, I think $69 you could have reasoned with, and $59 is probably the sweet spot for it, but they went for $79. Mario Kart World bundle in the Switch 2 is definitely the way to go, unless you absolutely must have that physical Switch cart. Moving on to the peripherals of the Switch 2. Now, obviously you have the Joy-Cons with the magnetic connection. I am a big fan of the magnetic connection. I do think that these Joy-Cons are much improved over the original Switch 1 and the Switch OLED Joy-Cons. They're certainly much more usable, handheld, including the little buttons on top for ZL and ZR. I am not as impressed with the thumbsticks as I was initially during the Switch 2 experience. They are fine, they're better than the original Switch ones, but those were kind of terrible. I do like the finish of it, I do like the buttons. Obviously a nice to have with the mouse mode functionality of this, and I think as more shooters and as more strategy games are added to the Nintendo Switch 2, you will get some better use out of that. The connectivity is very good. It's very easy to snap them on and get into a game, or snap them off and use them individually. The mouse mode is almost instant. I can be on the main screen here, snap off my mouse, switch to Joy-Con here, and then go ahead and start moving around even without the little feet. And you can see my cursor moving around just with my mouse right here on the table. So that functionality is certainly a nice to have. When I did try out Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, it was the mode that I preferred in terms of aiming in that game. The Joy-Cons are a nice step up. I do wish they went for some nicer thumbsticks, and I am never going to love the fact that we sacrifice an actual D-pad for the little diamond shape there with the 4 buttons. I understand why they do it. It's because when you obviously take off your Joy-Cons, now you've got 2 controllers. You can't really do that if you've got a entire D-pad there, but unfortunately that means you are going to sacrifice in any game that you're going to play handheld that does require a good D-pad. Now, moving on from there, a lot of people have been singing the praises of this guy right here, the Switch 2 Pro Controller. And there are a lot of things I definitely do like about this. I feel like overall, this is quite a big step up in terms of quality over the original Switch Pro Controller. However, there is one thing that really wasn't improved. Now, the thumbsticks have been massively improved. You can even hear it. If I put it up to my microphone here, you'll definitely hear it. Hear how it hits the sides? It's got almost a grinding sound to it. That won't happen with the Switch 2 Pro Controller because there's a gate inside it that actually prevents the stick from fully touching the side So these things feel really nice. They kind of glide around. I like the little touch on the top, that little gray throwback, along with the accents under the thumbsticks there. The Switch 2 Pro controller is a nice looking controller that feels really great in the hands. I also really do appreciate the fact that it comes with the triggers underneath. That is especially useful in games like some people have pointed out. It's actually useful in games where you have to hold down a button. Mario Kart's a great example. You can bind these to basically any other button. So you could bind it to the button for your acceleration in Mario Kart World and hold that down, and then use your other face buttons without having to do the little thumb yoga of holding down your gas and then hitting the other button. On top of that, games like Street Fighter 6 make a really nice combination. There are some really nice aspects to having triggers, and the fact that they just fit it into the form factor, so there's nothing like sticking out, no like thing you have to stick in there, like the DualSense Edge. Despite the fact that I really do like the DualSense Edge, I think they did a really nice job with the Switch 2 Pro controller. The other nice thing that they did is that even your old Pro controller, even third-party controllers that work with the Switch, work with Switch 2. This is something that PlayStation drives their fans nuts with. They release a new console and the old controllers either don't work, or they work for a set period of time, or they only work with old games. So a PS5 with a PS4 controller, the PS4 controller only works on PS4 games, unless you're gonna put like a converter or something on it. So otherwise you have to use the DualSense. Nintendo doesn't do that. So this works. I have some leverless controllers that can work with Switch and they work on it fine. I have third-party controllers, they work fine. So if you have a controller that worked on your Nintendo Switch, it will work on Switch 2. Now it might not turn on the system, so like waking it up from sleeping might not work, but everything other than that will work. Now it won't have that little C button for game chat, that one right there. And we'll talk about game chat in a bit too. So other than the game chat button functionality and the ability to wake the Switch 2 with a different controller other than your Joy-Cons or the Switch 2 Pro controller or another controller we'll get to in just a second, everything else will work just fine if it worked on your original Switch. As for the little accessories that come with it, they give you the little feet that snap onto your Joy-Cons. So you just pop off your Joy-Con there, and then it just kind of attaches. You can't put it the wrong way because it's got a little foot there, so it literally won't let it happen. And then basically that just pops on. It actually has, you can see it right there, there's a little button that pops out as it pushes away. But other than that, it just kind of snaps on and you're ready to go for mouse mode with that nice protective foot. These work nice. They don't have a whole lot of other use except for obviously the wrist strap functionality, and we'll see how much I actually end up using those over the coming weeks and years with the Nintendo Switch 2. The other two peripherals I ended up getting with the Switch 2 were the Gamecube controller for the Switch 2 and the camera. Now, the camera I think is set up to have some really good functionality straight out of the box, minimal tweaking, and it does a really good job of cutting out faces and cutting out backgrounds and making the whole chat experience very seamless and easy. The quality of the video is not that great. However, game chat as a whole I actually kind of like, which we'll talk about again in a bit. And this Gamecube controller, it feels really, really close to an original Gamecube controller, including how these buttons work. They're really that deep throw. So if you're looking for that throwback experience, you know, this is a great throwback to the original Gamecube controller and really the Wavebird too, because this thing is wireless, obviously, is rechargeable, and it has all the functionality of the original Gamecube controller. Now, it does have the update with the home button, chat button, and all that stuff on the top. And then it adds this little ZL button here. I honestly think they probably should have just said screw it and thrown another one of these boys over here, because it doesn't do anything to interfere with using this button. So if it was the original Gamecube controller, your finger would be here anyway. So this is really just a bonus That's one little nitpick that I have with it. I don't think anyone would have been really upset about deviating that tiny bit from the original. If you want that original GameCube experience, especially with some of the GameCube games you can play, if you have that extended expansion pass membership to Nintendo Online, then this will definitely get you there. So let's start with the positives of the Nintendo Switch 2. The first positive I want to talk about is the overall performance of the Switch 2. Now, when it comes to the brand new games like Mario Kart World, the performance is pretty much flawless. You're looking at a locked 60 frames per second if you're playing in single player, and even if you do split screen or even if you do the knockout rounds, you're not going to have big frame drops, and the overall increase in fidelity and visual quality over the original Nintendo Switch is honestly massive. The other thing is that in games that you can compare to other handhelds, mainly like the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally, the overall quality of the image it's producing, the frame rate, the battery life is all really comparable, if not better, than those units. So if you're considering the Switch 2 amongst its actual competition, which is not Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, but actually these other handhelds, including the original Switch, it does massively outperform the older ones, while at least being competitive with the highest end handheld PCs. The other immense success from the Switch 2, which is something we begged for from the beginning once Switch 2 was even starting to leak out with figments of imagination, is backwards compatibility. Now in this case, Switch 2 just straight up plays your Switch 1 games. Now there was originally an issue with backwards compatibility with a small handful of games. They've already done one patch for the Switch 2. They're working on more, I'm sure. And now the number of games that don't work with the Switch 2 is I think it's a handful. It's almost none. So the backwards compatibility of the Switch 2 is a huge win for Switch fans. And if you have a library of Switch games, much like I do, this is going to be the best way to play the majority of them. And on top of that, the thing that I think Nintendo undersold with this unit is what happens when you go back and play some of those Switch games that had unlocked frame rates and dynamic resolution scaling. Now, why is that? Well, this thing just straight up has more horsepower than the original Switch, obviously. I mean, it's, 8 years newer than the original Switch from launch to launch. Although people will tell you that they made this thing a year or two ago and it was ready to go and they just held off because the Switch was selling so well. Anyway, moving back on to my actual point here. There are many Switch games that we thought were locked at 30 frames per second, or we thought just had blurry images overall. But what ended up happening was, to get some ports to work on the Switch, they would use dynamic resolution scaling. What that means is, if the frame rate starts to drop, it will drop resolution to offset it. So the resolution comes down, which makes it easier on the Switch, so it can maintain a more stable frame rate. Well, the other side of that is, it would sometimes run with an unlocked frame rate. So there would be aspects of the game or sections of certain games where it would be at 60 frames per second or attempting to reach that. It's just that the overall performance of the Switch and the demanding nature of some games kept it around at 30 frames per second or worse in many aspects. But what's happened is now people are diving into their backlog of Switch games, finding games that ran kind of poorly on the original Switch, throwing them into the Switch 2, and the overall power and grunt of the Switch 2 means that it does not need to scale down the resolution like it did on Switch 1. So you end up with Switch games that looked terrible on the Nintendo Switch that are now a full 1080p on Switch 2 without a patch, because the system does not need to scale down to offset the loss in frame rate. The other thing that's happening is the frame rates are now super steady in almost every game. So if it does have a 30 frames per second cap, unfortunately, that's it. It's just going to hit that 30 frames per second cap and be pretty much pegged right there. But in games where there was an uncapped frame rate, it's now blasting it up to 60 or close to it in almost every single Switch 1 game. So this has turned into a state where, despite the fact that Nintendo did a really poor job of letting developers be a part of the launch process and actually prepare their games for the Switch 2, you're already seeing that benefit because of how underpowered the Switch 1 was compared to the Switch 2. There are many lists online that are going through and checking backwards compatibility and the overall performance uplift of the Switch 2, and we haven't even gotten to the Switch 2 versions of games yet, but just unpatched performance, pushing through those frame rates, and not needing that downscaling in resolution is leading to a lot more Switch 1 games which look and play fantastic. Now, getting back to the storage of the Switch 2, it does have much faster storage than the original Switch 1. Now, the micro SD cards that I mentioned before ran between like 110 and 150 megabytes per second. These new micro SD express cards run at almost a gigabit per second. It's really more like 800 megabits per second in their read speed. So in fact, this one's 900 megabits per second. Now, the reason why you have to go to this faster, more expensive memory is very simple. In order to run games off of that micro SD express card the same way you would off the main system, you have to have faster storage. 150 megabytes per second is not going to get it done. So it basically treats that micro SD express card like another solid state drive, whatever kind of drive they have in there. Now, when I first found out about it, I was honestly floored. I didn't know these things existed. I don't think a lot of people did, because when you use things like action cameras, like I do when I go out to different events, they use those slower micro SD cards, not the express. So I didn't even know this was a possibility. Now, the problem is, and I saw this coming a mile away, these things are really hard to get your hands on now. You can get the smaller ones, like 256 gigabytes or less. They're generally available. But again, it's just not enough space if you've built up a substantial Switch library, especially a digital one. Obviously, the minus to that is the cost, but the overall speed and the fact that you want to be able to play games off that extended storage at the same speed as if it was installed on the main system storage, Nintendo really didn't have a choice in the matter. And getting back to game chat, it's actually pretty good. There's something that happens with the microphone of the Switch 2 where it really does a great job at rejecting noise except for the voice of the person who's speaking. And the fact that it's built right in so you don't need a special headset in order to talk on game chat is really nice. So I don't see really a downside to game chat other than the fact that you need to have the Switch Online membership, I'm pretty sure, in order to use it. You can correct me in the comments down below. It works well, it's easy to do. It's the first time Nintendo's done it integrated into their system instead of just like a separate app on your phone. And I actually like game chat quite a bit. The fact that you can share footage of your game and then also use either Nintendo's webcam or third-party webcams also work with game chat. It's actually a pretty nice experience and pretty easy to do. Sure, it has its quirks. Sure, you're running your shared gameplay at like 10 frames per second or something, but it's just to give other people an idea of what you're doing. It's just trying to bring people together, and even if you're playing a completely different game, it's kind of like a more communal thing. Is it like integral? Is it required? Is it something they could have done without? I guess so, but it's here, it works very well. And honestly, I don't really have too many negative things to say about it. It's actually more useful than I thought. So as this is the positive section, the screen. The positive sides of this screen are obviously the size compared to the original Switch and the fact that it's 120 Hertz and variable refresh rate, which will come in handy in games not only that run at 120 Hertz, but also games that run in that VRR window that this can kind of offset. So a good example is Cyberpunk 2077 running in the performance mode gets into like the 40s, and the VRR of this can actually make that a more smooth experience. So it's another way to kind of offset the fact that this is a handheld system and does not have the same performance as your major consoles or a PC. Another positive side effect of the horsepower of this system combined with that faster storage is your UI. So, you know, just even navigating through the screens and stuff is much more smooth, and all of your online things are much better too. So one of the notorious things about the Switch, the original one, is that the Switch eShop was a really kind of a hassle. It loaded very slowly. There you go, it just loaded up there. If you're going through different games, different menus, it really was a pain and really unpleasant thing for a multitude of reasons. One of them was just the power of the Switch. The other was just the fact that the original Switch had very poor Wi-Fi that would drop off regularly. You can see how things are loading. I'll wait like 1/10 of a second and then I can scroll down more games. I don't know what the heck I'm putting on the screen right now. But anyway, you can see the difference in this thing compared to the original Switch and the Switch OLED. Just the performance and the UI and the ability to navigate these things is so much nicer on the Switch 2. Now, it is nice that they did add a little recording feature. If you use the screenshot button and hold it down, it takes a 30-second recording. The overall quality of that is, it's fair, I guess. It's not going to be the highest quality thing. Show you one for example here. Here's a Mario Kart world clip where I'm playing in battle. And, you know, it's 30 seconds long. I honestly couldn't tell you if it records at the beginning or the past 30 seconds. I don't even know. It just kind of ends up putting a note on the screen saying recording saved, and that's it. Like, so the instant you hold down that screenshot button to take a recording, it just says recording saved. But the fact that it's there is a nice upgrade over the original Switch. And of course, the other really nice thing is the fact that some games are already patched for Switch 2, and some of the biggest games on the Nintendo Switch now have upgrades for the Switch 2. So I can tell you that two of the games that I was most excited about for the Switch 2 were these two right here. That is obviously Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, running at 60 frames per second and a vastly improved resolution over the original Switch. Also, some games are getting free upgrades, much like No Man's Sky here, which these guys are just legends because they keep improving this game and not asking for a dime. So if you have a copy of No Man's Sky for the original Switch, download that free update. It is killer. And then of course you have games like Scarlet and Violet, which finally have a playable and enjoyable version on the Switch 2. Now, I will say that some of these things, like these upgrades for The Legend of Zelda, do require some kind of payment. In my case, I decided to go ahead and add the expansion pass, which I don't normally do, just because I wanted to use it to download these, as well as the upcoming ones for Jamboree and some other games as well. Plus, I figured might as well try it out so I can try all those GameCube games as well with the expansion pass. And the other thing is, because of the more modern technology, including like ray tracing cores and tensor cores, etc., I don't know what all of these things do, but I do know that they weren't included in older systems like the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro, and somehow they can get the performance of the Switch 2 up near Xbox Series S in some modern games, including Cyberpunk 2077. So I think the overall power of the Switch 2 is actually pretty surprising. No one is expecting it to beat a PlayStation 5, but for what it is, a handheld console that also converts into docked, it's pretty impressive, the performance of the Switch 2. Okay, now that compliment sandwich is over. Well, it's time to get into the negatives of the Switch 2. The first is obviously the price, not only of the system itself, but especially some of these games that they're saying will be depending on, I don't know, the quality of the game, the cost that went into the game, whatever arbitrary reason Nintendo has to raise the prices on games and peripherals. I mean, the Switch 2 Pro controller here, I think was like $80 or $85. These things are not cheap at all. Even the Gamecube controller here, I want to say this was $60, $70. I don't even remember. I'll put the price on the screen if I remember to do it. So nothing comes cheap with the Switch 2. My biggest gripe with the Switch 2 has to be the games available at launch. Now, as I mentioned, it's fantastic that you can play both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom on your Switch 2 with the upgrade pack and have a much better experience. But other than that, let's just go through some of the launch games real quick. And let's see why I didn't buy them. Hogwarts Legacy. Oh, yep, not gonna buy that one. Street Fighter 6. Nope. Cyberpunk 2077. Now the funny thing with this one is, I got it back on PlayStation 4 because you got the free upgrade to PlayStation 5 when you bought the game. So that's 3 of your launch games right there. 2 more of them are right here with your Legend of Zeldas. So it's like after that, the only things that are somewhat enticing are like Yakuza 0 and Bravely Default 1 Remaster, I forgot what the name of that one is, but the remaster of Bravely Default. So Bravely Default, Flying Fairy HD Remaster, Kunitsugami Path of the Goddess, which I believe I have either from Game Pass or PlayStation. One of them had it for free. Civilization 7, again, is on other platforms. Deltarune is another interesting one, although they didn't really have a physical for that. Fast Fusion is actually pretty cool because it's a $15 game. It is digital only, at least to this point, and people have been pretty positive about it. I haven't given it a shot yet, but that is actually kind of enticing. Fortnite's free, obviously, and is played elsewhere at higher frame rates and better resolutions. Hitman World of Assassination, same thing, played elsewhere at better frame rates and resolutions. Mario Kart World is pretty much the only exclusive reason, other than the upgrades to the Zelda games. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2S has been done many times before, so it's a puzzle game. And then we're going to get into the other reason why there aren't great reasons to do this. Sonic X Shadows Generations. I think I got that one on PlayStation 5. I haven't gotten to play it yet. It's somewhere. Anyway, that one is actually no upgrade path for the Switch 2 version, which is pretty disappointing there. And then the other one that interested me was Yakuza 0 Director's Cut. Now, I've never played Yakuza 0. In fact, I haven't played any Yakuza games yet, although I own a few of them and intend to play them eventually. But that brings us to the other problem with the Switch 2, game key cards. In fairness, I think it's kind of difficult to formalize our opinions on game key cards so far. The main things that we know about them are, number one, the game is not on the cart at all, not even a bit of data. Basically, it's just a physical version of a digital game. So you get all the negatives of a physical, meaning you'd have to put the cartridge into it without having the physical game on there. So God forbid, 20 years from now, they take everything down and there are no consumer protection laws, well then this thing becomes absolutely useless. The positive is, it is physical, you can resell it if you wanted to trade it in or something like that. There is some value there. It's really gotten a big stigma because of the fact that there's nothing on that cartridge. It's not even really a cartridge with memory. I will say for myself, it has dissuaded me from buying Yakuza 0, which again is probably the only physical game that I'm interested in picking up right now at full price or near it. In the future, if some of these things go cheaper, it might be interesting to have, say, a Cyberpunk on the Switch 2 in a physical form, or even like a Street Fighter 6. It would be nice to be able to play that on the go, as I'm a big fan of that game. But the fact that I already have it performing on other platforms at a higher level, and the fact that they're game key cards, it's like two nails in the coffin, if you will, of purchasing these brand new launch games. And even looking towards the future, they've got Elden Ring in the pipeline, but again, it'd be nice to play it handheld, but do I really want to play Elden Ring on the Switch 2 with some of the video that we saw from the original release? Now, once they get Duskbloods, that's going to be the test, because people are going to have to buy Duskbloods on the Switch 2. It's Switch 2 exclusive. If you're a FromSoft fan, that's the game you're going to have to buy on the Switch 2. So hopefully that's on an actual physical cartridge and then they won't have any problems. But Elden Ring, I believe, is going to be on a game key card. So if they do that with Duskbloods, I don't even know what's going to happen with that. Maybe people will just buy it digitally for the convenience of it. Maybe they'll still buy it physical, but it's very confusing times with the game key cards for physical purchases on the Nintendo Switch 2. Another thing people have been complaining about with the Switch 2 has been the battery life. Apparently there is a bit of a bug, so if you have super short battery life on your system, you may actually have to go into service mode in order to get the full functionality of your system, which is, embarrassing to say the least, and definitely shouldn't have been a thing, but who knows, maybe the updates will eventually patch that out for Switch 2 in the firmware. But overall, I would say that the battery life is kind of to be expected. I mean, it's just a much more powerful version of the Switch. So one thing that's interesting is if you're playing Switch 1 games, you end up getting much more battery life out of the system than you do on Switch 2. However, if you're playing stuff like Mario Kart World or Cyberpunk 2077, In my experience, you're getting like 2.5-ish hours out of the system, which is still pretty decent, but it's definitely not up to the overall battery power of the original Switch. But considering the form factor of the original Switch and how underpowered the processor and graphic unit in that system were compared to the Switch 2, it's kind of understandable why you get so much more battery life in the original Switch than you do on Switch 2. I mentioned a few times, but the internal storage at 256 gigabytes is not enough. You're almost certainly going to need one of those micro SD express cards, which I don't understand why they didn't just make a version that had a 1 terabyte internal drive in it. Sure, you could have bumped that up $100 or something like that, but people would have absolutely paid it to get that, just like they will eventually with the next OLED version, which you know that thing, when the OLED Switch 2 comes out, inevitably it will have a 512 gigabyte or 1 terabyte internal storage. They will get it eventually, but I don't know why they didn't just do it with the original system, because they're gonna have to pay, you know, $60 to $100 for more internal storage on the micro SD express card. Why not just offer a model that had more storage from the beginning? Okay, let's talk about the screen of the Nintendo Switch 2. As I mentioned, the good side is the 120 Hz and the variable refresh rate. The negatives are it's advertised as HDR10, but the HDR results from people who have looked at this screen, it's just not up to par. And certainly if you're coming from an original Switch OLED, it's just not going to look as crisp and vibrant and have the same dynamic range as the Switch OLED or Steam Deck OLED. Now, I have heard people explain that because they went for the 120 Hz with the variable refresh rate, that probably led them away from OLED, because OLED can have flickering issues with variable refresh rate depending on the screen. I guess TVs do it better than handheld screens that are OLEDs. I don't know all the details about that, but that would make some sense, besides the fact that it keeps down the cost for Nintendo so they can make a little extra money on these units. But the screen is fine. It's not great. It's not really great for HDR. In most circumstances, it's fine. You just wish you got a little more than fine for $450 or $500, and something at least as good as the last model with the Switch OLED. Another really silly mistake, in my opinion, but it's probably because Nintendo wants to keep all this stuff secret, is the fact that they did not support developers with developer kits, dev kits, ahead of the launch of Switch 2. At least many of them. So this, I think, really backfired in terms of what games were available with Switch 2 patches ready to go on day one. That's really unfortunate, because now we're in a situation where we're waiting for the next Switch 2 Direct to drop and tell us what the next games are going to be. Obviously, Donkey Kong Bonanza is in the pipeline here. Metroid Prime 4 is in the pipeline, though we don't have a direct date on that yet. As of right now, the Switch 2 library is very lacking, and the number of games that are ready with that Switch 2 update is really minimal. The thumbsticks of the Switch 2 are pretty much similar or the same type of technology from the Switch 1. They're slightly better feeling, but who knows if we're going to end up with the same stick drift situation as the original Switch. Very few games support mouse mode on launch. There's basically just the Welcome Tour, which no one should be paying $10 for. Basically just kind of like a fun manual for their new system, and the Cyberpunk 2077 port for Switch 2, and obviously the things that you can do in the menus in the interface, and Civ 7, Civilization 7 I think is the other one that's going to have that mouse functionality right off the bat. I know Metroid Prime 4 is coming with it because I did get to try that out in New York, but other than that, it's really pretty limited, so I would like to see that mouse functionality expanded out. They are very quiet on releases upcoming for the Switch 2, with the exception of Duskbloods, though that's still, I think, 2026, 2027, I can't remember. So that's at least a year away. And Mario Kart is fine as a launch game, but it's not Breath of the Wild. It's not that single player experience that's different from everything else you've ever played. It is Mario Kart. It's good, it's fun, it's great for families, it's great for getting people together and having fun, it's good for casual players, but it's just Mario Kart. In closing, the Switch 2 is very similar to something like a PlayStation 5 Pro, although the leap in hardware between the PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 5 Pro is much smaller than the leap in hardware between the Switch 1 and Switch 2. There are some big negatives for longtime Nintendo fans, like the Mario Kart World $80 price tag, like the game key cards, that will definitely dissuade a lot of people and leave a sour taste in their mouth. I'm hoping that these third parties will either get a discount from Nintendo on actually using physical cartridges, or just find that the negatives from producing game key cards for their sales are so bad that they go back to physical game cards. But obviously at this point, with the number of third-party games, it's probably 95% of them that are using these game key cards, there is definitely too much financial incentive for these developers to use it, or for these publishers, I guess I should say, to use them. And I hope that changes in the future. The Switch 2 can be a big boost to an existing Switch 1 library. Obviously, I want more developer support so that they can go back and release actual full-fledged Switch 2 updates to these games. However, it's nice to see that you can go back and play some of the more demanding games on the original Switch with much improved graphic fidelity and performance on the Switch 2 without paying another dime. So the Switch 2 is great for an existing library and pretty poor for the Switch 2 ecosystem on its own, just due to the lack of support and lack of library. The Switch 2 definitely still stands up to the Nintendo seal of quality in terms of its overall function, form, build quality, and performance in this case, which is much improved over its predecessor. It's nice to see that Donkey Kong Bonanza's on the horizon, and this most recent Direct actually had a lot of really interesting elements to it, which made much more sense than the game that I ended up playing at the Switch 2 experience in New York. So I'm happy to see that. Along with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, coming in the near future, those are two very exciting releases coming to the Nintendo Switch 2, which will definitely be a nice step up over what they're currently offering. One other point to make is that Nintendo also did a really good job producing units ahead of the launch. There really haven't been any massive issues with scalpers and people not able to get their hands on the Switch 2. That has basically led to the Switch 2 becoming the fastest selling console in history at like 3.5 million units in 4 days. Kudos to Nintendo for getting ahead of the scalpers on the supply of the Nintendo Switch 2. But at this point, it's time for Nintendo to push the envelope. They now have the hardware, they now have the ecosystem, they have the library already in tow. Now they need to hammer it home. This is the time for Nintendo to strike, but to do that right, they need to open up the library, allow developers to release Switch 2 patches to upgrade everyone's existing libraries, and give people a reason to jump into the Switch 2 system. Make this system all it can be, and do it in a hurry, because it's only a matter of time before the Switch 2, just like the Switch 1, becomes outdated in hardware and someone releases a handheld PC that crushes it in all of these games. The Nintendo Switch 2 has been a really good experience overall. It's not without its weaknesses. It's certainly not without my personal gripes, but let me know in the comments down below. What has your experience been like with the Switch 2, or are you still debating whether or not to jump into the Switch 2 ecosystem? As always, this is Pyrus for Pyrus Gaming saying thank you for watching, and until next time, I will see you there.